Thank you, John. Rana Mitter is ST Lead Chair in U.S.-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is the author of several books, including Forgotten Ally, China's World War II, which won the 2014 RUSI Duke of Westminster's Medal for Military Literature, and was named Book of the Year in the Financial Times and Economist. His latest book is China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. His writing on contemporary China has appeared recently in Foreign Affairs, the Harvard Business Review, The Spectator, and The Guardian. He has commented regularly on China in media and forums around the world, including at the World Economic Forum in Davos. His recent documentary on contemporary Chinese politics, Meanwhile in Beijing, is available on BBC Sounds. In 2020, Dr. Mitter won the Medlicott Medal for Service to History. He previously taught at Oxford and is a fellow at the British Academy. Founding Forward is honored to welcome Dr. Rana Mitter.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a huge pleasure to be here at the Union League tonight, and I'd like to start by thanking our hosts Founding Forward today. Wonderful welcome from John, from Jeff, and Corey, who actually organized the bringing of my person today from Boston to Philadelphia, in the midst of a situation we're currently in where air traffic control may or may not actually be actively on the job. I consider it a considerable act of brilliance on his part to actually make sure that I could end up here today, and I'm very grateful for that. Now, Corey, all we have to do is try and get me back tomorrow, but we will see if that comes together. It's also a huge pleasure to be here in Philadelphia to talk about a subject which, in some ways, I think continues to be of immense interest and importance in all sorts of different ways in terms of its relationship with the United States. The history of the US and China is a very long-standing one. You could take it all the way back, but let's say certainly for the mid-19th century, the connections between the two countries have been pretty notable in all sorts of ways. And what I'd like to try and do today is to tell you a little bit about the past of China, because, and here I have to make a confession, which I hope will not lead you to start throwing peanuts at me at great speed. I am in fact a historian by training, and therefore spend an awful lot of time thinking about China's past. But I do it in service of trying to give you some ideas about where China is now and where it may be going in the future as well. The only thing I'm going to do at this point, before I start giving a little more detail of some of the topics I'd like to cover today, is to say that the one thing I can guarantee about this talk tonight is that almost everything I tell you is going to be wrong. And I want you to have that warning in mind, and I'll explain why that is. If I can make the technology. There we go. Supposing I were here at the Union League, let's say 120 years ago. I'm not sure if any of your more venerable members might remember that particular period, but I'm assuming that only perhaps a few people right at the back would actually recall that moment. But supposing you had been here and you had likewise a lecturer coming to talk to you about the wonders of China. Up in the top right-hand corner of this picture, you might have been shown this image. In the top right-hand corner, which is of the then Dowager Empress of China by the name of Cixi, a formidable figure, someone who'd been involved in that year 1900 in fomenting the famous Boxer Uprising, a rebellion against Christian missionaries and Chinese Christians within China finally put down after the intervention of foreign armed forces. And after that, the Dowager Empress stayed at court, but her position was in some ways quite compromised. But at that point in 1900, surrounded there by actually the wives of American diplomats in Beijing, everyone would have assumed that the story that you needed to hear was about how China's traditional empire had reinvented itself after the disaster of the Boxer War and would be moving forward actually into a period of significant reform. I think that very few people sitting in a hall in 1900 hearing about China would have been able to project forward just 20 years from that point and know that China at that point would have lost its 2,000-year-old system of imperial government, that it would be, instead of a traditional empire, a turbulent republic which was riven by warlord faction fighting and essentially a country that was in danger of falling apart. If you'd gone to that 1920 moment, once again, I think very few people would have been able to project forward another 25 years to the image that you see in the middle. And again, sorry, it may not be quite as clear as it should be, but if you sort of screw out your eyes really, really hard, you will see that in the middle are a couple of very well-known figures, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, looking rather splendid in his white safari suit. And on either side of him, two very significant Chinese figures. On one side, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of China during the mid-20th century, and his very impressive wife, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, Sung Mei-ling, actually a major power broker in China in her own right. That picture was taken in Cairo in 1943, at the height of World War II. And again, very few people, I think, in 1920 would have projected forward to thinking that China would be in the middle of a desperate war for its survival against the Japanese, but also that China's leader would be sitting at the top table of diplomacy with the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the British Empire. And certainly, I imagine that very few, if any, of the figures in that picture, not Winston Churchill, not FDR, not Chiang Kai-shek, would have projected forward less than 20 years, just 15 or 17 years, to the image on the left-hand side, where China had metamorphosed in less than 20 years from being a Western wartime ally against the Japanese to becoming the world's largest communist superpower, with Chairman Mao on the right-hand side there, and Stalin on the left-hand side as close friends in socialism before falling out disastrously and managing to essentially split with each other, almost coming to blows. And then finally, fast-forwarding about 40 years from that particular Sino-Soviet moment, we have just at the bottom right-hand corner, the 11th of November 2001 in Doha, Qatar, the signing of the World Trade Organization agreement to bring China into the WTO. Again, I doubt that either Stalin or Mao would have thought that just a few decades hence, China would be at the heart of global capitalism. And I think it's also fair to say that neither the Americans, the Chinese, or the others signing that WTO treaty in 2001 would have projected forward another 20 years to where we are today, at a moment where trade conflict rather than cooperation characterizes the relationship between China and the US. So the only reliable thing I can say about the last 120 years, as you see, is that with China, past performance is not a guarantee of the future, and that any projections I make today about what might be happening in 20 years from now are almost certainly wrong, but nonetheless, hopefully useful in terms of our discussion today. Nonetheless, even though the specifics of exactly what China is going to be and how it's going to act, either in the present day or in 20 years' time, are not always immediately obvious, there are clues and there are significant patterns that will shape the way in which we can make some judgments. And those, I think, are worth taking seriously. I want to start with just a couple of lines about what I think, and again, feel free in the Q&A to question or push back against any of these ideas, but what I think, broadly speaking, is the way in which China is defining its geopolitical role. I think that, as things stand, China is aiming to become the leading power in the Asia-Pacific region, and it is seeking global influence. That global influence, I think, is being sought in a whole variety of different areas. I would say that right now, as we speak at this moment in 2025, its economic role is probably the one that it finds singly most important, particularly in the areas of investment, the significant increase in the sending out of foreign direct investment to many parts of the globe, and also its increasing power in the world of finance. Other roles, though, of course, remain important. China is growing its military power. We'll say more about that in a few minutes' time. And as we speak, has the second largest military in the world after the United States, and an annual spend of around, depending how you do the numbers, $168 billion or so. It's still relatively weak in terms of what has been termed soft power. And I have to say, this is a term coined by the famous Harvard political scientist Joseph Nye, dear colleague of many of us at Harvard, who passed away sadly earlier this spring. But Joe Nye, I think, will be remembered particularly for this term soft power, which is used to express how you can persuade rather than coerce other countries or societies to essentially follow your path. China has traditionally, in its current incarnation, not been very effective at that use of soft power. Overall, all of this filters into a way of keeping score, so to speak. And if you were to go into records in China, which used to be actually kept quite public, now tend to be more confidential, this term 综合国力, comprehensive national power, is used to express the combination of all of these sources of power, economic, military, and indeed cultural. And China basically looks at the way in which other major actors, the United States, the European Union, India, ASEAN, and so forth, are all scoring in these various areas and benchmarks itself against those numbers. So if you want to ask a Chinese policymaker about how China is doing, ask where they think China is scoring on this index of comprehensive national power. In seeking to shape the way in which it operates in the world, and again, in just a few minutes, I'll show you some specific examples of what I'm talking about from past and present, I think it's fair to say that there are at least 4 sources of conduct and shaping of political thought that are relevant in China. These are not the only systems of thought by any means that shape China, but I think they all have a determinative part to play in terms of understanding why China operates in the world in the way that it does. The first, and in some ways I think actually the most deeply embedded, is China's own experience of modern history. And when China talks about modern history, it has a very particular definition, which starts in 1839. 1839 because that was the outbreak of the first Opium War. In other words, the moment at which the British Empire came to the shores of China, wanted to sell opium, grown in British India and processed in British Southeast Asia, into the interior of China. China's then imperial rulers said no, they did not want the sale of opium in their territory, and the dispute between these two sides led to an all-out war which ended with the defeat of China in 1842, the handover of the island of Hong Kong, and then a century or more of essentially China being on the back foot globally, having to cede more territory and legal rights to other empires, to the French, to the Japanese, to the Russians, and let's not forget also to the United States, which also played a significant part in this particular episode of opening up of China's markets under coercive circumstances. So that history lasts all the way through until World War II, when China finally, along with its allies, we saw there, the Soviet Union and the United States and the British Empire, not the Soviet Union at that point, defeated the Japanese and essentially entered a new era in which China was more in control of its own destiny. But the memories of what the Chinese still call the century of humiliation, 百年国耻, is something that still shapes policymaking in the present day. The second factor is economic legitimacy. Again, I think many people in this room who know something about China will be aware that the economic reforms that took place under Deng Xiaoping, a leader we'll come back to in a few minutes, enabled China to lift itself out of being a desperately poor country to where it is now, which essentially is a middle-income country with a per capita income on average across the country of around $10,000 per person. And that growth in economic legitimacy does not make up for many of the other things that, of course, are much more restricted, including political freedoms in China, but it's part of the argument of the social contract that China's ruling party, the Communist Party, has made with the wider population. The third factor, what I call pre-modern thought, is sometimes given a shorthand, which is not entirely accurate but useful, of Confucianism. In other words, a pre-modern system of Chinese philosophy and ethics, not religion. Confucianism is not a religion, it is a worldview and an ethical system, but one that was heartily rejected, not least by the early communists in the early 20th century, but has now been re-embraced with a vengeance, you might say, by today's Chinese Communist Party, which some people nickname, as we'll see, the Chinese Confucian Party, for reasons we will see. And then finally, last but not least, when thinking about the Chinese Communist Party, over 100 million people in it, ruling over a quarter or nearly a quarter of humanity, the clue is in the name. This is a Marxist-Leninist party. It still very much is driven by the precepts of those particular thought systems. And I often think that sometimes when you get these sort of slightly sort of offhand statements, you got particularly in the 1990s and 2000s, that China's ruled by a communist party, but doesn't really believe in ideology. It's much more pragmatic. It's all about business these days. I would say not. I would say the ideology has always been important. And I cite you none other than the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, who has declared that he has always been what he calls a 21st century Marxist. So we'll work out in a little bit what it actually means to be a 21st century Marxist. But I would say that when he says that, we would do well to believe him. Before we get to some of those present-day elements, though, let's talk a little bit about which parts of the past are most relevant in shaping the China of today, and of course, potentially that China that we project 20 years or more into the future, assuming that we're daring enough to think that we could actually make that kind of prediction. And two ideas, which I think emerged in their modern form more like 150 years ago, at the end of the last Chinese imperial dynasty, the Qing. For those who don't read the Romanization normally, the Qing, that's a ch sound, so the Qing dynasty, the last of China's dynasties, started in 1644, ended with a revolution in 1911. And in the last days, when the Opium Wars were raging, when China seemed to be under siege from the outside world, when the old imperial system appeared to be collapsing without any clear sense of what would come next, two ideas emerged as to what the performance indicators should be, what the goals should be of the newly reforming Chinese state. So, number one, we have here at the top, 富国强兵, a rich country and a strong army. This is actually a very old Chinese phrase, but it's one that was revived in various ways, actually through the medium of Japan, which reformed itself and modernized itself in something called the Meiji Restoration in the 1850s, 1860s, in a much more comprehensive way than China did. And so the Japanese version of this phrase, fukoku kyohei, was essentially kind of re-borrowed back into China by reformers who wanted to talk about how the combination of a strong military presence and a growing economy could come together to try and revitalize China. And I would say that despite all the twists and turns and changes that have happened since the 1860s and the 2020s, about 150, 160 years, the key goals of China in some ways are exactly the same: rich country, strong army. The second phrase is actually invented in the late 19th century because it suited the circumstances of the arrival of Western empires in China, and that's 中提西用. Chinese learning for the essence, Western learning for practical use. In other words, a battle which went on about if the old system of traditional Confucian thinking and philosophy, if our own technology, and don't forget the Chinese way back in the day invented gunpowder, they invented the compass, all sorts of technology originated in China, and yet by the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution coming from Europe had really changed the balance on technology. So the Chinese are saying, if we want to learn from Western technology to defend ourselves, that's fine, but we still need to work out who we are as a people, as a society. How can we be Chinese at our essence, but learn from Western countries for practical use? And again, fast forwarding 150, 160 years, in an era where China is now innovating in technology in some of the most astonishing ways possible, in quantum, AI, biotech, and yet it's still going through debates about what it means to be Chinese. In some ways, that second debate, the Chinese learning, Chinese essence, Western practical learning debate, is still very much going on today. Other events deeply shaped the trajectory of China through the 20th century. Despite what I've just said, there's no straight line, or at least not an uncomplicated straight line, between the experience of the late 19th century and the China rising to superpower status in the 2020s. Amongst the tragic obstacles in the way of that was World War II. And again, while this isn't the primary subject of what I'm talking about today, I do want to take a moment just to remind people in the 80th anniversary year of the conclusion of World War II, 1945 to 2025, quite how devastating World War II was for China, simply because it's not even now, I think, that much known and remembered in the Western world. We don't have exact figures even now for the number of deaths caused by the war, but 8 or even more million, maybe as many as 14 million, according to some quotes, is a number that you can reckon with. That includes not just combat casualties, but for instance, 4 million people killed alone in one massive famine caused in central China directly as a result of the war. And many other tragic deaths can be added to that number. In addition, something like 80 to 100 million of China's people had to move within their own country under terrifying circumstances and became internally displaced refugees for much of the wartime period. And while on the left-hand side we have a, I think, rather lovely picture of an American GI and a Chinese soldier lighting each other's cigarettes, reminder that the context of that involved scenes like the one on the right, which was the aerial firebombing of the temporary wartime capital at Chongqing under the leadership at that point of Chiang Kai-shek, whose picture we saw earlier. So the devastation that World War II caused, the kind of turn in the road in terms of a fitful modernization in the early 20th century that was blasted pretty much literally out of existence in the 1930s and 1940s, cannot be underestimated. Not least because it brought to power, as well as to mind, brought to power perhaps one of the most significant revolutionary movements of the 20th century, the Chinese Communist Revolution under Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao. It is said in one of those stories that's supposedly too good to check. I've tried to check it and haven't entirely succeeded, but just between us, right? So I'll tell it. That in 1972, when Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, was in charge of China, he reopened full diplomatic relations with Japan. And the then Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Tanaka Kakue, came to visit Mao in Beijing. And in the conversation, Mr. Tanaka, who had been in his younger days a Japanese soldier in wartime China as part of the invasion, essentially apologized to Mao for the fact that he'd been part of this invasion and occupation of China. And in the version of the story, Mao replied to him, "Oh, Mr. Prime Minister, don't worry about that. The Communist Party is very grateful that you invaded China, because without that, we would never have come to power." And while I suspect, as I say, it's one of those stories that's too good to check and certainly to verify, there is a strong argument that the massive devastation caused by the Japanese invasion of China set the ground, not least in the countryside, for the revolution that would ultimately bring Mao to power. And in doing that, he essentially instituted, not least, as you remember, just flicking back for a second there to that, there we go, to that image. His new best friend after the Communist Revolution in 1949, of course, was Joseph Stalin. And in combination with what you might call the elder brother of global socialism, Mao's China undertook a Soviet-style command economy, socialization of the economy, and of course, entry into the world socialist system. So in the 1950s, it's often said that China was isolated from the world. That's not true. China was isolated from the United States, and that was very important, but it wasn't the same thing as being cut off from the global trading system. China traded with East Germany, with Czechoslovakia, with Poland, and of course with the Soviet Union. It was very much built into that system of international socialist economics, and trade fairs in Canton, Guangzhou down in the south, were part of that international trade. Internally, however, internally, Mao's China took some absolutely disastrous paths, and one of them was the attempt to try and create self-sufficiency in agriculture and industrial production, resulting in a policy known as the 大跃进, Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was supposed to be a system of socialist economics that would be so successful that it would produce, for instance, in the countryside, immense amounts of grain that could then be sold overseas, because there'd be so much excess grain it could be exported for the profit of China's overall economic situation. In fact, people essentially were claiming to have produced huge amounts of grain when they had not done, and grain was literally removed from the countryside and exported overseas to the Soviet Union, while increasing numbers of farmers starved in the countryside because of the lack of food. We still don't have exact figures, but certainly more than 20 million people starving to death in China's countryside is regarded as a reasonably accurate figure for that particular episode. Far from being abashed, though, after the policy ended in 1962 and relatively mainstream agricultural production was brought back, Mao nonetheless thought about his next phase of keeping the revolution that had brought him to power robust and lively, and ended up in launching the Cultural Revolution, an extraordinary movement which lasted between 1966 and 76 for a decade or so, in which essentially he acted from within to overthrow his own party. So he remained leader of the Communist Party, of the Chinese Communist Party, but many of the top leaders under him were suddenly arrested, persecuted, essentially thrown out of power. The father of Xi Jinping, the current leader of China, was essentially arrested arbitrarily. In fact, it happened slightly before the Cultural Revolution, but during the Cultural Revolution, his arrest became worse, and his son, Xi Jinping, of course, the leader of China today, but at that point he was 13 years old and was sent out to the countryside to live as a peasant, basically, which he did for the next 7 years. He tried repeatedly to run away, in fact, from exile and was repeatedly sent back. So the Cultural Revolution overturned lives of everyone, from the most elite to the peasantry out in the countryside during that time. And that picture shows Chairman Mao dressed as a Red Guard. In other words, the youth, the kind of militarized youth who were kind of reinvented, as it were, as Mao's vanguard for launching a youthful revolution that would smash all of the old feudal culture that he felt was still holding China back in the 1960s, and instead reinventing China as if it could be renewed from point zero in the crucible of the Cultural Revolution. As I think most people who know anything about Chinese history know, the Cultural Revolution failed. Certainly it did not fail in smashing the old culture, but it was entirely unsuccessful in creating a new one. And after Mao's death in 1967, after a short period, a couple of years of interregnum, his successor, the veteran revolutionary Deng Xiaoping, came to power essentially formally or semi-formally in 1978, at which point he undertook a complete reversal of policy. I mentioned that the socialist command economy, Stalinist style, was operating in China in the 1950s. 1960s, you have the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. And then in the 1980s and into the 1990s, yet again, you have a shift in which socialist China undertakes the world's biggest market economic experiment. And again, I won't go through all of this in detail, but a whole variety of contextual things come together in the 1970s and 80s to make China's economic miracle possible. Essentially, the planned economy operates in much of the world during the early Cold War, but then the dollar becomes dominant as other currencies begin to fade. And from the 1980s, with the arrival of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and other neoliberal economic thinkers, you get places like Chile and indeed China itself as part of that mixture. China is inspired to think about how economic reform, particularly in a market direction, might stimulate its economy. In the 1980s, essentially, China and America become more and more entwined with each other. The US debt goes up massively in that time because the US then, as now, can print large numbers of dollars and remain the world's reserve currency. And China at that point is producing large amounts of goods, first of all, textiles, light goods, furniture, plastic toys, etc., and then continues to move up the value chain, but nonetheless is producing while the Western world buys from it. This only sort of gets reset massively in 2008 when the system fails in the global financial crisis. And ever since then, essentially, China has been trying to plow its own path, essentially with an internally self-contained economy as much as possible, but with a globally oriented trading economy, a highly mercantilist economy that looks to export elsewhere but restrict exports into China itself. And within that, many of the same battles that Mao fought back in the Cultural Revolution of increased wealth versus more equality continue to be debated in China today. Deng Xiaoping, at least famously said, supposed to have said, some people have to get rich first. Whether he actually ever said that or not literally is still in dispute, but nonetheless there is a wider sense that that idea that as China became richer in the 80s and 90s, it also became more unequal, still troubles many people in China today. Nonetheless, that era was one in which China changed very considerably. Some images here from the 1990s in China. Jiang Zemin, who privatized very large parts of China's economy, including its old smokestack industries and iron factories. They're shaking hands with President Bill Clinton. And so images there actually of a remarkably free media, that's a TV show and those are newspapers in China. Not free in the sense that we would understand it in the Western world, but nonetheless investigative journalism that could uncover social evils, programs, TV programs that actually challenged some of the old orthodoxies of the Cultural Revolution. All of those were visible at times in the 1980s and 1980s and 1990s in China. They have almost all been squeezed out under much harsher censorship in the 2010s, 2020s. My point there being that even under its authoritarian system of communist rule, there have been times of more open authoritarianism, relatively liberal, or not genuinely liberal, and times of extreme repression. And sometimes the pattern has gone from open to closed in quite quick succession. Much of the shift in recent years, of course, comes with the rule of the current ruler, Xi Jinping, who took power in 2012, 2013, and remains very much on the side of control as opposed to letting things open out in terms of more diverse and varied thinking. And in doing so, Xi Jinping and those around him who run China today have been looking at different ways in which they might think about how to define the China of the present day. And they've been doing so very much with all of that history I've gone through quite quickly, but I hope, with some of those high points that you've remembered, or low points, you might say, the century of humiliation, the experience of World War II, the Cultural Revolution, and also that idea of Confucian thinking as a kind of background that in some ways helps to shape China. So in trying to work out how this might be transmitted to the wider people, sometimes the methods used are a little bit broad brush, you might say. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. In terms of one of the political debates that's going on in China right now, which doesn't, I think, have an obvious solution, it's a question of how far is China today a Marxist society, and how far is it a Confucian society? In other words, how much derives from that kind of long-standing philosophical basis that has shaped China for a very long time, and how much comes from this much newer idea of Marxism and Leninism as the socialist background to contemporary China? Well, you can have, and people do have, very long, abstruse philosophical debates about this question with many, many footnotes. And if you are ever having any problems getting to sleep at night, I highly recommend you read many, many editions of Qiu Shi, the theoretical journal of the Chinese Communist Party, large piles of which you can find by the bedside of people who are suffering from insomnia. Assuming that you are not in that position, an easier way to digest this particular debate comes through this TV show, sponsored by the Chinese Communist Party and shown a couple of years ago on national TV in China, on the rather literally titled When Marx Met Confucius. So this consists, as you can see, of two actors, both with shamelessly fake beards. The one on the left, in case you're wondering, is Confucius. The one on the right is Karl Marx, in case there's any confusion there. I'm also willing to put a fair amount of my money on the fact that that moon at the back also may just possibly be fake as well. So I would say that there's not so much kind of no expense spare, but kind of no expense spent, really, I think, on this particular show. Anyway, there are 5 episodes of this. We watch it, so you don't have to, although if you really want to, you can find clips on YouTube. And they debate at great length in this show about whether or not this kind of German-derived European socialism or this indigenously derived Chinese philosophy is really the basis of the kind of politics that the high-tech, highly authoritarian 21st century China actually needs. And at various points, Karl Marx at one point, I think in episode 1, says, I always felt quite Chinese myself, although I'm sorry to say he doesn't say that in a thick German accent, which would add to the atmosphere. And not to spoil it for you, if anyone wants to watch this series, cover your ears now for a couple of seconds. I'm going to reveal the ending to you. It turns out that Marx and Confucius are entirely compatible in China, as long as you understand it through the thought of Xi Jinping. There's a surprise for you. It's known apparently as 第二个结合, the second recombination. So if you want something to puzzle people to put on a T-shirt, there's your slogan. So this, in other words, is an example of how popular culture is sometimes used by the system to try and get these ideas over. I have to say, China's social media community, which is full of lots of very sharp and usually quite irony-aware people, did not think very much of this TV show. It did not go down very well with the wider viewership, but it was an attempt to try and make that wider point. Meanwhile, other aspects of the China of today, I think, are grounding themselves in stories and developments that are actually likely to be much more significant in shaping China's engagement both at home and in the wider world. This, as I'm sure you don't need me to tell you, is a massive solar farm. It's actually, I think, in Anhui province in eastern China. And it's at the heart of one of the narratives that may not make a great TV show, with or without fake beards, but actually is probably more likely in the current moment to define, probably for decades, the major diversion between the United States and China in engaging with the world. And that is around the story of energy. Right now, there are some figures about China's production of post-fossil fuel wind, solar, nuclear, also a non-fossil fuel technology, hydro, and other non-oil, non-gas energy production. China is still, of course, burning huge amounts of coal, I should add as well, but it's both a world leader in renewables and, of course, a huge fossil fuel provider. The difference is that the US is, because of the change of administration, no longer leaning into rivaling China on the green front. Instead, we have two different narratives, one of which is very much about LNG and fossil fuels, and one of which is about the production of global technology of green tech. You will all have your own ideas, perhaps you'll bring them up in the Q&A in just a couple of minutes, about which is the right way to go. But I would say that when China is telling a story about itself in the global south, in Indonesia, where I was sort of just earlier today actually talking to a former member of Indonesian government, in South America, in sub-Saharan Africa, the moral narrative that China chooses to project about itself is now more and more tied to green energy. So if the story of Marx and Confucius meeting looks perhaps a little bit unlikely to take off, the green energy narrative might have more success. Of course, that happens at the same time as one of the other elements that China tends not to stress, but nonetheless has to be brought into the equation, which is the security question. And here we have, of course, perhaps one of the most obvious ones, which is the question of Taiwan and whether or not it continues its current autonomous status in the wider world. It is a lively liberal democracy. It is also an unrecognized state in terms of the United Nations. China claims it as its own territory. The United States, up to now, has kept what's been known as strategic ambiguity about whether or not it would enable Taiwan to defend itself in the case of an attack. Some facts and figures and graphs there certainly about the increase in Chinese military spending. The short answer is we don't know quite what would happen. My own estimation, for what it's worth, again we could talk about this, is that I think that China is probably in the short term more interested in trying to influence Taiwan's domestic politics to get an electoral outcome in the next presidential election, which is in 2028, that will be more suitable to China's aims. Even with this military spending, a physical invasion of Taiwan would be very difficult. It would involve a kind of amphibious operation that would, dwarf D-Day in terms of size, but nonetheless, the military capacity is being put together to get there. So, along with the green energy narrative, we also have a military narrative which sits in a parallel, but by no means separate space. And all of these are part of the calculations being made in China. One last element as we come to the end of my comments is to think about perhaps the single area that I think is most relevant and most important really to understand in its significance between not just the United States, but the Western world and China, which is the competition over science. Right now, it is fair to say, I think, that China is beginning to make alliances in terms of scientific cooperation with many countries that are not now science superpowers or technology superpowers, but may well be so in the 2030s and 40s. If we are making predictions, you remember at the beginning I said that all of these predictions are almost entirely certain to be wrong, but assuming that they're not for a minute, assuming that in the 2030s and 2040s, many countries will continue to grow in terms of income, average income, demographics, and overall wealth, many of those countries will begin to also, I think, develop their own science ecologies. The UAE, Brazil, Singapore, Malaysia, these might be other examples of those middle-income countries. Right now, China is making all sorts of tech agreements and cooperation agreements with them. Infrastructure, quite often, including, for instance, 5G platforms, are very much coming with technology that comes from China. Right now, the Western world often does not have good answers to how it is going to be a meaningful science partner to these emerging economies and emerging societies. But I would suggest that doing so is one of the most urgent questions of our time. Not necessarily in terms of it being either or, but in terms of making sure that the broad spread of different alternatives in terms of science, ecologies for the next generation of people who will invent the technologies that affect us all are going to involve US and China and Chinese presence, and that we're not yet having a serious enough debate about how that's going to work out. Let me finish with a couple of images there of things I haven't had time to get to, but maybe in our Q&A we will cover as well. China appears in many different places, both at home and in the world, and the contradictions of China are captured in these pictures. Bottom left, a warship, again possibly the new generation of aircraft carriers. That's not an aircraft carrier, but nonetheless, it's not the latest aircraft carrier, I should say. The aircraft carriers that are defining the new Chinese naval presence in the world, capacity to project out into the Indian Ocean. And yet, top left-hand corner, China is also significantly involved in UN peacekeeping in many post-civil conflict environments around the world. In the middle, we see Africa, a part of the world where Chinese investment is becoming more and more significant in many ways, including the purchase and control of critical minerals, which are going to be central to technology for all of us. And then also on the right-hand side, two images from recent hit TV shows in China. On the right-hand side, Quang Biao, not only a kind of great cop thriller, but actually also a reflection from within China about what official corruption actually means, something that you can actually talk about in straitened circumstances in China in a way that people who know about the censorship but don't know the detail sometimes actually are surprised to find. And finally, at the bottom, a clip from China's Got Talent, a kind of show which I think you will be very aware of, showing that even in China, sitting down in front of an extremely entertaining, mildly brainless talent show is often a good way to spend an evening as well. On the other hand, it's obviously much preferable to come here to the Union League and have a proper discussion about serious matters rather than, as we say in Britain, vegging out in front of the television. So I'm very glad to have had the chance to speak to you all here today. Many thanks to Founding Forward and to all of you. And I think we can now open up for some questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. On that last kind of international, geopolitical, regional politics, lots of questions. So let me start with this one. Does the United States' disengagement in many parts of the world facilitate Chinese efforts to exercise soft power?
So that's a really interesting question. I would give you actually the words of at least one significant Chinese political analyst I've talked to, who says that actually the thing that China should be most wary of is thinking that because the US is disengaging in the various ways that the question mentions, therefore people will automatically turn to China. And he thinks they won't, and I think that's right. I think that China, if it wants to increase its soft power, its power to persuade rather than coerce, is going to have to do a lot more work than it's doing at the moment. I think China does have public goods that it does have a lot of success in getting to the outside world. And I mentioned green energy perhaps as the one that's most attractive to parts of the wider global south that are worried both about not having enough energy to keep their middle-class populations going, but also worry about climate change. At the same time, the soft power, the feeling that the Chinese system produces a kind of culture that in some ways transcends boundaries, the way in which the Cold War United States was famously able to use blue jeans and rock and roll and all of that, Coca-Cola, to essentially create the image of a society that in some ways was there to be aspired to. I think that that is still some way off. But, and I will say this as an acknowledgement that things may be changing, I have been surprised when I talk to middle-class people in India, I'm going to give a specific example there, not all middle-class people in India, but a significant number, as to how much they look at the economic growth that China has managed to put forward, and sometimes talk about the way in which, if the system there was changed towards something closer to China, it might push in a direction that they would find in some ways attractive. I think that's a minority view, but I've heard it more often than I would have done 15 or 20 years ago, and I think that's something we have to all watch out for.
That leads to a question, I think, that many had. There's 3 or 4 questions about the regional powers, India, Vietnam, Philippines, South Korea, Japan, and their relationship with China. Is there any chance that China can make significant gains in relationships, friendly relationships, in that part of the world?
I think that essentially what's going on at the moment is two different struggles in two different and crucial areas of global politics. One is about geopolitical security, and one is about geoeconomics. And they are more and more in the Asia region beginning to diverge, possibly to an extent in which there could be a real difficulty in reconciling them. Broadly speaking, here I'm going broad brush, but just for reasons of time. Broadly speaking, I would say the vast majority of countries in the Asia-Pacific region, when pressed, would still prefer to have the United States as their security partner and would be very worried if the United States were to withdraw from the region. The exceptions, I think, other than China itself, would be very, very pleased if that happened. The exceptions would be probably Laos, Cambodia, a few other sort of small countries that are very China-oriented. The others, I think, are very keen to make sure that that presence doesn't disappear. However, for the last 20 years or more, the general story you will hear in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia is that the United States has essentially given up on trade and handed over that particular baton to China. So for instance, again, just to give one example, famously, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that was supposed to at one point come into being in the mid-2010s actually ended up being, and people sometimes forget this, subject to serious criticism, not just by Donald Trump, who won the election the first time round in 2016, but actually also by Hillary Clinton, who didn't say that she was going to abandon it, but did actually say during her election campaign that she was going to look very seriously at whether it was a good idea. Meanwhile, China and Southeast Asia got working on RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is still, which as of now, is actually probably the most significant trade framework in the region. It has China right at the heart of it. The United States is not a member. And when we think about some of the other groupings, even the CPTPP, the smaller successor to TPP, again, the US is out of that. China's out of it too, but wants to be in. So security and trade are heading in different directions, and more countries, I think, in the region are wondering whether they're going to have to choose.
A question from one of our St. Joe's prep students. Do you think the AI race between China and the United States is the modern-day space race? And I'll just add this. Are there comparisons to be made between space or nuclear arms races of 40, 50 years ago and the AI races today?
Great questions, and yes, in many ways, absolutely. A lot of people are specifically calling it the new Sputnik moment. And again, historians amongst you will remember that in 1957, the sending up of Sputnik, the Soviet satellite, into space, served as a kind of wake-up moment for the US technology enterprise as a whole and the space program in particular, leading, of course, ultimately to the United States being able to put the first men on the moon just over a decade after that. And yes, I think AI could be regarded as being in that category, along with the idea of nuclear weaponry, because it has the potential, as we all know, to be very dangerous. And essentially, a lot of AI development is happening now without a huge amount of knowledge of where it might go. But I think probably in terms of immediate significance, I'd bring you back to one of the comments I made briefly in the talk that will flag up again. To do AI in a large-scale way involves tremendous amounts of energy hunger. The capacity that's needed to essentially run all those data farms, and actually many of these specific, the names people will know, ChatGPT, DeepSeek on the Chinese side and so forth, are very, very energy hungry, involves thinking where all this energy is going to come from. And that is one of the reasons why actually that question of where the next generation of generations, so to speak, comes from, will actually, I think, be one of the most determining factors in the AI race. To get to the next level of AI and its usability and its capacity to be able to transform economies and societies, you need to be able to power it. Right now, China is doing everything it can to try and push that as far as possible. I mean, just within the last few weeks, you may have heard the massive new hydropower installation has been announced that will happen basically on the Himalayan borders. There are plenty of other examples as well. And many other parts of the world, including Southeast Asia, right now are being left behind in that energy race. So I would bring those two factors together.
Question about the one-child policy. What are the impacts today, and what might be the impacts in the next generation or two?
The impacts are significant, but I think that they are longer term than they're sometimes made out to be. So I think people here will know, but just to say very briefly, essentially from about 1980 to 2015, the law in China, and this was globally unique, said that you could have only one child in your family, with a few exceptions in the countryside and for certain other groups. But essentially it was a one-child policy, certainly in China's cities. And no country before or since has put that kind of restriction on family size. Its aim was to try and reduce the size of China's population, and overall in those terms, it did at least reduce the rate of growth. But it left China, or has left China, it's in the present tense, with a very significant demographic problem. The policy was essentially changed and then, essentially abandoned in the present day because it became clear that China was becoming much older, much more rapidly. And certainly by the middle of this current century, we could well be in a situation, if we have a kind of linear extrapolation from where we are now, of something like a quarter of the population of China being aged over 65 and needing pension provision, healthcare, and all sorts of things without... I was about to say that will come early. By the middle of the century, we could be in a situation where actually there are more people who need healthcare and pensions than workers who are actually going to be able to provide for them. That, though, is a couple of decades away. In the short term, I would say that there is space for essentially what China is trying to do, which is to convert itself to an economy that has fewer workers, but those workers provide more value in areas like technology, AI, and so forth. And I think the real battle in China today, an inwardly directed economic one, is whether or not that transition is actually possible. Certainly, younger people today, I would say that the major problem right now is not the demographic crisis, that will come, but rather the fact that so many young people in China feel deeply disillusioned with their economic prospects. They no longer believe that there's a good job waiting for them. They no longer believe that kind of getting involved in the kind of economic rat race is going to get them the apartment and the automobile and the happy marriage and so forth they might have expected before. In that sense, China is not so different from large parts of the Western world, which are also going through a period of introspection and concern about whether the economic fate of the next generation will be worse than that of their parents.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Professor Rana Mitter. Professor, thank you so much.